Wendy Lower, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you for having me. Good to be
Uh,
here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, and it's going to be great to discuss your new book that I have right here, The Ravine. And so before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do, and then how you came to write this book?
Okay. Well, I'm an historian. My focus is the Holocaust. I completed my PhD in history, and I've always have been writing and researching on the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, specifically as it occurred in Eastern Europe since the early 1990s, basically since the collapse of the Soviet Union. For anyone who's interested in my deeper biography, I could just mention I went to Hamilton College as an undergraduate, also in history and German language, and studied abroad in Vienna. And that really gave me that kind of orientation to Europe and European history. And then I went to graduate school in Washington, D.C. at American University and studied with an historian who had written, at the time when I first started graduate school, a very important biography of Himmler. And that was also very influential in my intellectual development. And that's what actually took me to Ukraine in the summer of 1992. Because that book situated Himmler and Hitler and the other Nazi elites in Ukraine during the Second World War. So that's why I started to move in that direction. And from there, I worked at the Holocaust Museum for many years, which was, those were formative years, not only in the history of that institution, but also in my own thinking about history as something that should reach the public and can be portrayed and reconstructed in all these different ways, as museums do, differently than traditional empirical studies of history. And I taught in the University of Maryland system at Towson State. I moved to Germany for 5 years and wrote a book there called Hitler's Furies. And then I came back to the United States in 2012 and took up the John K. Roth Professorship at Claremont McKenna College. And was also named the director of the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights at the college. And I've been out here in California since then. Yeah, that's my story thus far.
And how do you like being a professor?
I love it. I went back to the Mandel Center, the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies, which is the research kind of arm of the museum in DC. And I took on that directorship. I was acting director there for a few years, and I love the institution. I love everything they do there and their mission, but I realized that I preferred to be in the classroom and I preferred to be around young people with formative minds and futures ahead of them. And that kind of every year, every academic year that students come in, and it's just this rejuvenating kind of experience. So I decided to return to California.
Great. And obviously, I mentioned your new book, The Ravine. And can you explain why you wrote the book, what inspired you to write it, and what that process was like?
Sure. This book really started with the photograph, which is at the center of the book. A lot of the work that I've done, starting really with my dissertation on the Holocaust in Ukraine, and then Hitler's Furies, which is about women, German women and their reactions to the Holocaust. And then another book I wrote on a diary. A lot of it has been driven by the discovery of sources. I find it, at first intriguing when I come across something that seems anomalous or rare or shocking, or just kind of grabs me. And then I kind of want to follow up on it and to see just how much can be unpacked and discovered. And that process of discovery is really about what the book, The Ravine, is about, a discovery behind this one singular photograph. And this has been kind of my pattern in my other work as well, kind of finding a documentation file on women who were perpetrators, or finding a diary and committing to that source. So The Ravine began with this photograph that was brought to my attention in 2009. I was at the museum in the archives in DC. Actually, I wasn't, as I mentioned, I was living in Germany. So it's kind of extraordinary that I had flown back and happened to be in the archives on that August day, working on another project. And these journalists came in from Prague with this photograph, and it was part of a series. So they had this one in addition to a few more taken by the same photographer. And my colleague just came up to me. I was at the microfilm reading, in the reading room at the microfilm reader, kind of in this little cubicle space. And he said, he just kind of tapped me on the shoulder and said, I think you should take a look at this, and brought me around the corner, and it was on the table, and a group of us were just looking at it and started to just try to identify what we were seeing in the picture. And I don't know if you want me to go through that a little bit with your audience, if they may not know what the picture is and why it's important.
Yeah. What's startling about the story behind the picture is that oftentimes when we associate, the Holocaust or World War II, we see photos of, dead bodies, and that's startling and, sad, obviously. But there was something about the photo in particular where it's a woman and her child, correct, standing at the end of a ravine with two Ukrainian, I guess, soldiers or people that helped the Nazis, and then two Nazi officers. What is it about seeing that photo where it's the last moments of somebody's life that really kind of got you going on this journey?
Well, it is an action shot, if we could describe it that way, in the worst sense of that characterization. It's the act of murder. It's the final moments of a Jewish family, the child at the center of the image and the mother. And so the loss of that, of the innocence, of the life of a family, and these guards at very close range. In fact, one of the Germans almost seems to have his hand kind of placed on the back of the woman. And so it's both the shocking last moment with the smoke kind of billowing up, but also this proximity of the killers to the victims, and almost in a kind of intimate kind of cluster of individuals there, including the collaborators, the Ukrainian collaborators, who are standing kind of shoulder to shoulder with the Germans. You can see their caps, their insignia. You can see the coats of the militia with the armbands, and they're holding these rifles. Would find out later on that these were Red Army coats that had just been quickly repurposed for these militia who were recruited on the spot when the Nazis invaded in the summer of 41. And you can see their faces, their grimaces, and their expressions and their posture. You can't see the faces of the victim; they're covered in the smoke. And then you can see in this image the landscape, the way the photographer, who's at close range as well, maybe 20 feet away. So, you realize I'm looking at this up close, and this was taken up close. And that means the person who took it openly was participating in this, and presumably a collaborator. And it's in broad daylight. You can see the light passing through the trees. You can see what I thought was a ravine, but actually is a large pit that had been dug by the victims, and also by local Ukrainians, in this case, Ukrainian girls who were left behind in the kind of occupation society. And then the various elements of what we have come to know as the Holocaust by bullets. These are the Jews who were massacred in mass shootings, primarily in the former Soviet Union, outside of the gassing centers, outside of the camp system. And it's a significant number. It's at least 2 million of the victims of the Holocaust. And they are very, very difficult to trace because they were not registered in the ways that the Germans registered the deportees to the camps.
What was it about the Ukrainians in particular that the Nazis found so abhorrent, maybe, that they decided to just kind of plow through Ukraine and kill so many? I think you mentioned in your book that a quarter of the Jewish victims in the Holocaust were from Ukraine. So what was it about Ukraine that was so different?
Right. So 1 out of 4 victims of the Holocaust reside in what are Ukraine's borders today. So that's the calculation there, but just, you're right, that's an enormous number. So why do we not know that much about those victims and this history? Well, first of all, historically, this was the Russian Tsar king had set up the Pale of Settlement. Actually, it was the queen. It was set up in the late 18th century under Catherine the Great. And so when Poland was partitioned, the Russians acquired this part of Poland, and it was heavily populated by Jews who had been arriving there since the 15th century and had been invited by the Polish kings. And so there was a very high population of Jews, in some cases in these shtetls, these historic communities. 30–50% of those towns were inhabited by Jews. And it's the kind of thing that we might imagine as part of like Fiddler on the Roof, right? This is these are these spaces of Jewish life. A lot of it is, very vibrant culturally and religiously, but not necessarily very wealthy. A lot of tailors, a lot of peddlers, and but these communities that had been intact, for centuries. This particular community is Mariupol, is the name of the town. It's about 100 miles west of Kiev, and in its heyday had at least 4,000 Jews, and it was on the map of Jewish history going back to medieval times, and in fact was so important in many ways for the Jewish community in this central Pale of Settlement that ethnographers traveled there in the early 20th century to try to capture this history before it disappeared, the vanishing shtetl. So a gentleman by the name of Ansky brought a photo crew with him as well and started collecting the stories, and it resulted in a play called the Dybbuk, which is staged pretty regularly around the world and was made into a movie. And that's the setting. Mariupol is actually the town that is the setting for that play. So, I got into the history of this town, and of course, the photographer and the killers here and the Ukrainians, that's not what they're thinking about, that, that wonderful history that's being destroyed. But for the Nazis, this was a target for them because of the high population of Jews, and they were so determined in their genocidal campaign to destroy every, as Hitler said, every Jewish family on the continent of Europe. He didn't want them to return and avenge the deaths of their relatives. So that kind of root and branch genocide was really targeted in these locations where there were these high populations of Jews. So that's why Ukraine and Poland, parts of Lithuania, really experienced this onslaught in a very overwhelming and really rapid way as of the summer of 41.
Yeah, what's startling, again, in your book, you give a kind of a brief overview of the history of the region. So it goes from Tsarist Russia, where these people still can't catch a break really, but there's a Pale of Settlement, and then pogroms, and then you enter the Soviet Union. And I think it was best described, I read a book called Bloodlands by Timothy Schneider, where even before World War II, you have these mass murders going on in Ukraine. Then you have the genocide, which is Holodomor, which is the famine in the 1930s. And then all of a sudden you have this new enemy, which are the Nazis. And it seems like for 400, okay, maybe 300, 400 years, this group of people cannot catch a break. And sometimes I don't know which one is worse to see, the famine or the murder because by the Nazis, because it just still seems the same to me. The intent is to kill these people and to eliminate them.
There were absolutely, it's historically a place of extreme violence and anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish violence in the history of pogroms, as you mentioned. And they were it was very severe after the First World War during the Bolshevik Revolution. And then the terror famine in the early 1930s, which was part of Stalin's attempt to revolutionize the region along this Soviet Bolshevik ideology and to, make the great, the 5-year plan, the economic kind of modernization, that imperative that they were pursuing, their 5-year plans were part of that. So yeah, by the time the Nazis come, you have, and Snyder's terrific about laying out this intertwining of Nazism and Stalinism and the assault that this, the devastation is created in such a short period of time and within one generation. And it's an escalation of that violence. Some have talked about it as a kind of double occupation. The Poles refer to it in that way, and the Hungarians. But yeah, it was just for the local population, just to survive those waves of terror and violence and come out of the Second World War. Really no family was intact, no Jewish family, no Ukrainian family in these regions, and even, the Germans because of the war. So it just was all around just absolutely catastrophic.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is the role of collaborators, especially in Ukraine, because that's where you focused your research on. But I forget his name. There was a famous documentary, and it was a big story, I think, in the 80s and 90s. It starts with a D.
Demjanjuk?
Yeah.
Yeah. I went to his trial in Munich.
Right. And you talk about that in the book.
Yeah.
There's a documentary on it. It's on Netflix. I saw it.
Uh-huh.
I had no idea about this. Never heard of the story until like a year ago, where I watched this. And the guy was clearly lying and covering up his crimes. And but
he wasn't lying when he was accused first of being Ivan the Terrible at Treblinka, and that was a misidentification. And so he was deported to Israel and stood trial and was found guilty, and even I think given the death sentence, and they had to revoke that because they realized that they had misidentified him. But he was Ivan, and he was terrible, but he was at Sobibor. He was not at Treblinka. So the Germans, when they tried him, 2011, I think it was 2010, and he was found guilty as well. They determined that in fact he had been a guard at Sobibor, and was basically pushing Jews into gas chambers at Sobibor.
And what is the role? Why was it so pervasive for there to be collaborators in Ukraine? And it seems like there was a lot of them, like willing to, shoot their own people in some ways.
This is such a complicated question, but it really is at the heart of this image. This is an image that shows in the most stark way collaboration and resistance. The collaboration of these killers, Germans and Ukrainians here, who don't share the same language and are just carrying out this act together. And it's just understood. It's just the power of this and pervasiveness of this anti-Semitism in Europe. The Germans needed support. They needed men on the ground. They were fighting a war. They had real kind of like practical needs, manpower needs, and quickly assembled any able-bodied men who remained behind, because many of the men were evacuated with the Red Army, including Jewish men, who ended up being among the sole survivors because they evacuated and came back and found their communities destroyed. But of the Ukrainians who remained, they were kind of recruited on the spot. Many of them volunteered. They saw opportunities for advancement. They were coming out of a system. You just mentioned the Holodomor and the struggles of the Stalinist revolution. There was a lot of animus there because of what happened during the Holodomor, a lot of anti-Soviet sentiment, the rise of Ukrainian nationalism, the dream that Ukrainians had to form their own nation independently, their autonomy, hoping that they could align with the Germans to achieve that and break free of the kind of Soviet yoke of Moscow. And so they had, in some instances, that agenda, but mostly these Ukrainian militia weren't as they wanted Ukraine for Ukrainians, but they weren't, in some politically active movement. They were more opportunistic. They wanted material betterment. They wanted houses. They wanted clothes. They wanted a paycheck. They wanted the boots, the uniforms that were being distributed. They wanted the training, the military training. They wanted the weapons. So, the Germans were very successful at recruiting these individuals. Some of them were really kind of like marginal elements and suddenly had that opportunity. There were some nationalists kind of among them, but the Germans weeded a lot of them out pretty early on. They didn't want that to become a political movement. But yeah, the ratio is, in these small towns, the Germans could not be present. There was not like kind of German Gestapo headquarters in every little town like this. They had to rely on the locals, and they had basically, maybe one German gendarme commander and a platoon of like 18 to 25 Ukrainians or ethnic Germans from Ukraine who would make up the kind of, the patrol unit. So they were then mobilized and deployed for these so-called killing actions. They had to do a lot of the dirty work, as the Germans would call it. When the German Einsatzgruppen and mobile killing units were carrying out these mass shootings in the summer and fall of 41, their boss Himmler, Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's right-hand man for the entire implementation of the Holocaust, I mentioned him before, he was concerned about his men and their nerves and, just how difficult it was for them to carry out these massacres. And so they increasingly relied on non-Germans to do this kind of dirty work, and Jews themselves, Sonderkommando.
Yeah, and I think that's evident again in, for example, Christopher Browning's book, Ordinary Men, where you have regular people carrying out, and they really were regular people that carried out these horrible crimes, and they did have certain reactions. There were people that threw up while doing it, and they did find it sickening, but in some almost perverse way, they kept doing it because it would be weak of them not to do it, which is a very interesting psychological study of people. But what's another thing that's interesting is the fact that the reason I suspect most people don't know about this side of the war, they know about the obvious, the Holocaust and the war on different fronts and all that, is because whenever a researcher, you mentioned this in the book, tries to bring it up or research these topics further, they get either shut down, they get threatened in Eastern Europe. What is the reasoning behind doing something like that?
Why would one continue to pursue it, or why would one be threatened?
Both, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, first of all, it's, a large portion, right? So we established that it's an enormous number of individuals who were murdered. So that in of itself, that fact, demands our attention and our inquiry and historical writing and research, and memorialization and education. So, I mean, if we can't take genocide seriously, if we can't take these events that demonstrate what we're capable of, and it's, it's almost existential, right? I mean, if you ignore this, and frankly, a lot of other historical episodes of this magnitude, as far as, genocide and mass human rights violations, like the history of slavery, or that, what has been suppressed in many ways in our and taboo in our own history here in America, of the annihilation of the Native Americans. So, these are really important historical episode is too mild a word, tragedies and catastrophes. And I'm of the view that this is important to study. So, and shouldn't be suppressed. So that's, why I go about it, why we have institutions that support it, and a memorial culture and so forth. That's reason enough for me to argue that it has to be studied. But it is difficult. It's difficult because it brings us it's affective. It generates these kinds of emotional reactions, especially if you're the descendant or you're somehow personally connected to this history, which I am not. I have the privilege to do it from kind of a distance. But you know, these are difficult subjects, and they bring us a sense of kind of human shame when we study this. If we start to depoliticize and just realize that this is really kind of a universal problem, it has very specific history and specific context, but it's really about us. And you know, the situation in right now in Poland and in Hungary, whereby this kind of work, you know, shames the nation and should not be front and center because of the kind of discomfort it brings, or this sense of betrayal that it kind of evokes in that political culture, is just, it's you know, an attempt to whitewash this and not deal with our responsibility for it as humans, not as Poles, not as Ukrainians, not as Hungarians, but, you know, the problem is that it's too kind of ethnicized, it's too politicized, instead of pulling back and realizing, you know, to our peril if we don't really just accept that this is what we're capable of doing. And you know, until you pull back like that and understand it as a human condition, you know, how are you going to be empathetic towards the Rohingya? How are you going to really try to mobilize a intervention or prevention program for genocides that are occurring around the world today, if you can't appreciate it as this human condition that we all share responsibility for?
Yeah, I think the first step in fixing a problem is acknowledging that there was one or is one, right? And it seems to me like Germany did a pretty decent job at it, where, I mean, maybe they had no choice because it was so blatant, but these other countries that you just mentioned, maybe Poland, Ukraine, they saw themselves more as victims in this
Yeah,
whole thing, which again, rightfully so.
occupied. Yeah.
Yeah, and they were occupied, so they don't want to talk about the some of the bad things that happened in the war, because they're like, we dealt with enough bad stuff in our history, so we don't want to mention this. It's almost the same thing as when the Japanese don't teach the you know, the genocide of the Chinese during World War II in their history books, because they were bad enough. Now you don't want to mention all the other stuff. So I'm not saying I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying there's that rationale too.
Yeah.
One of the
And I'm glad you mentioned that too, because it's easy now. And this is where I think that there are those, there's that pushback in the part of the Poles and the Hungarians and other, or the Lithuanians, and the way the word collaboration is just such a trigger for all of this. Yes, they were occupied and experienced a Nazi onslaught and were sent to the concentration camps and were mowed down, the Polish intelligentsia, from the very beginning of the war. The mentally and physically disabled. I mean, they were all considered Untermenschen, kind of inferiors in this racial hierarchy. So, you know, it's absolutely important to establish that and remember that, and that loss of life and the resistance movements within Poland, for instance, that were so important for communicating these crimes and trying to intervene. And the rescue efforts that individuals pursued. So yeah, all of this is part of the story. But obviously there are a lot of gray areas, a lot of gray zones.
Yeah, and what are, again, one of the painful parts of the book? I mean, personally, my parents come from Ukraine. They both come from the former Soviet Union. So
Where do
this
they come from in Ukraine?
both from Kiev.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah,
Okay.
this book was hit close to home, even though I was born here. So one of the painful parts was when you described going to Ukraine in, I think it was 2014, correct?
Mhm.
And you go to Mirapol and you see the town and what's happened to the town since, and it's been probably um, sorry, my math is going to be off here, 60, 70 years since the end of the war, and
Mhm.
the city is still dealing with the repercussions of the war. And it just, you paint a very powerful picture of poverty and
Mhm, mhm.
distress. What was that experience like when you went to Ukraine?
Mm. The first time I went was the summer of '92, in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine got its independence in '91, August. And it was just kind of the Wild West, just a complete breakdown. No real police forces in place, rolling blackouts, hyperinflation, just the collapse of a system that was already just on its last leg, and an economic kind of implosion. And but also a moment of, for Ukrainians, culturally very exciting, in Zhytomyr, where I was, and Kiev, just the return of the national colors and of dress and celebration and all the hope and promise. And there were Ukrainians coming to Washington. I was working with them in the Library of Congress, and there were groups coming studying the American Constitution. I mean, they were writing their Constitution and trying to figure out what model to follow and comparing to different countries, the German Constitution. It's just fascinating. So just building something from the ground up, and young people, entrepreneurs starting businesses, and you know, and a lot of that was really you know, that promise started to kind of wither because of corruption and reimposition of kinds of bureaucracies and graft, and you know, and just the Ukrainian Russian relationship, and the Russians continuing to want to be present, influential, and to also keep their grip on Ukraine's resources. And this continues to this day, I mean, with Putin and the war. So it's just a very uh, you know, interesting experience of historical moment there. And I went back almost, you know, every year, every other year, so on a regular basis, and developed relationships with family and there, and friends, and doing work there, and traveling around the country more, Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, and working with organizations there, trying to get Holocaust studies going, including in Kiev with colleagues there. But absolutely, especially going into these smaller towns, the contrasts, the extreme poverty, kind of like a time capsule, a time warp as far as rural life and the peasantry, but also these, as I describe in the book, in a place like Mirapol, standing in that marketplace and those empty spaces, you know, and looking at postcards from the 19th century and realizing these were really vibrant marketplaces, and where there were, you know, shops, and you know, interactions of Jews and Ukrainians weekly at the bazaar, and you know, just a whole way of life. And you know, at that point in the 90s, one couldn't even turn on the lights. I mean, we couldn't get things. We were people were bartering everything. You were exchanging linen, you know, for toner, or you know, it was just this kind of chaos. But I experienced incredible hospitality, sorry. And people were coming when they found out I was doing this research, like knocking on the door of my host family. Oh, we heard about this American, and we have a story to tell. And they were just like elderly Ukrainians who had Jewish classmates, or had wartime experiences of being a slave laborer, Ostarbeiter. And it was as if this lid had come off, and they could speak openly, and they had me, you know, like a captive audience, a listener who was then going to bring that story back to Washington. And that, so there were people coming, I mean, every night. And I was, it was exhausting, but, and I couldn't speak the language. So I had to, it was exhausting for my interpreter, and I was just taking notes, you know, but the stories that just started to emerge, that was very exciting. And I try to incorporate that as much as possible. I recorded them, and I footnote them, and I include them in my writing.
Again, what's powerful is the fact that people are so willing to tell these stories. Is that also a testament to the fact that Ukrainian society was not open to hearing their voices, and that's why when they finally had somebody that was willing to listen, they poured out the way they did?
Yeah, I think that that sense of feeling of freedom, and it could speak without, you know, self-censoring, not the fear of the KGB, you know, knocking on their door or being denounced. Now, I'm sure there were many people who did not, there were many who didn't come knocking on my door out of fear. I mean, that's very real there too. But yes, there, and it had started in the late 80s with Glasnost and this introduction under Gorbachev of, of freedom and new notions of freedom. But the Soviet version of the war, the official version, universalization of victims, for instance, suppression of Ukrainian national identity, or demonizing that, referring them as traitors to the homeland, all these kinds of categories of or ways of writing the history that suppressed these stories, the uniqueness of the Holocaust, for instance. And it's very trite, it's very cliche to say this, but I think eventually the truth does come out. I think if it's something this big, and that many people witnessed it because it was in broad daylight, and whether they were carrying those traumatic memories as far as what they witnessed, or carrying the grief of a loss of a friend, or seeing a Jewish classmate with getting his eyes plucked out. I mean, I just can remember these stories. They just they needed to, I guess we'd say in our kind of psycho parlance today, psychobabble, they needed to vent, they needed to unload, it was cathartic maybe, and then they were very Western oriented. They were excited about being a part of Western Europe. And so having a Westerner come in who was going to return to America and thinking about an American as someone who could be that messenger, and that was going to be a new chapter for the country that would be more westward looking, that was also, like the driver in the Ravine who takes me to Mirapol, who's come out of the war zone. I think he was in Kharkiv or Donetsk, I can't remember, but who had escaped with his family to the region in 2013, and was really even physically had been beaten, like he was still was manifesting his wounds. He could not, when he was my driver, but he had broken ribs and all of that. He was still suffering from that. It was clear. But he was determined to kind of drive me around. And then he brought me to Kiev, and he brought me to where the Maidan was, and he was introducing me to people. And, so he saw it almost as his own kind of little diplomatic mission. And when we went to be with him in Mirapol to be looking for this site, he saw the photograph, and he was also helping me. It was just, I think, really remarkable that he was himself living that history of violence today with the war. And then suddenly he was my ally in trying to uncover this historical episode that he didn't really have a direct connection to, right? But, wanted to be a part of that. So I love Ukraine, actually. I have no family history there, but ever since the first time I went there, it's just such a beautiful country. And I just feel like its history is so understudied, and it was this horrible crucible of Nazism and Stalinism, and suffered such tremendous losses of life, of resources, of cultural devastation, everything in the 20th century. Like you said, some countries, some communities just seem to get like hammered historically, and Ukraine is one of these countries. And so I encourage people to visit it. I encourage people to study the history, and also to take a closer look today at what's going on there as far as Putin's occupation and war in Crimea and on the eastern border.
Yeah. A personal question, because I whenever I read books about the Holocaust or any of these situations, one of the really good books that I read was Richard Rhodes, who's wrote a book called Masters of Death. I think it's his lesser known work. He wrote a bunch of books about the atomic bomb and nuclear energy and stuff like that. Won a Pulitzer Prize for it, but he wrote this book, and there he chronicles Babi Yar in a chapter, and then other lesser known massacres in Ukraine. What always boggles my mind is how seemingly easy it was for people to kill another human being. And maybe it's because they somehow managed to dehumanize them by calling them, vermin or cockroaches or whatever.
Mhm.
But how do you see these Nazis and the collaborators? How, can you begin to understand them in some way, or is it just human nature that you can kind of learn to dehumanize somebody and then kill them almost easily? So that's always mind-boggling to me. Why is it so easy to kill another human being in these situations? Or maybe it seems easy, I don't know.
Yeah, no, these are the most vexing questions, and they really are what drives this inquiry. And, the fact that we have so many really some of these unresolved issues in the history of mass violence and genocide, from the perpetrator side and also kind of from the victim side. And it's really that's what drives this inquiry, because it is so, these are questions that are big questions, and they kind of remain open-ended. There are no simple answers. We only can identify kind of pieces, and you've mentioned a couple of them, because this continues, right? And in all these different ways. Ideology is absolutely important, that we as human beings have this amazing capacity cognitively and intellectually, the brain, right? That we are, that many of these Einsatzgruppen killers, were had PhDs, and that Germany was this most cultured country and had Germans, nationals, Jewish Germans, German nationals. They had been receiving, racking up Nobel prizes, and so that was really dumbfounded a lot of people, like how, and Ukrainians and Jews, and the Germans came in, oh, they're civilized, they're civilized. They're not going to carry out these kinds of, they're not going to act like Stalin's henchmen because they're Germans, So we come to realize that, being cultured, being educated is not going to safeguard us against this kind of ability to commit this violence. They can coexist. So what's going on? Well, psychologists have theories about splitting and, what we, and denial and repression and all kinds of tricks that we play in our minds in order to carry out these, follow through on these acts, and then turn around and go home and hug your wife, So that's a realm of really interesting research that has come out of genocide studies and involved psychologists and social psychologists. And, part of the book is about these big questions and how different scientists or researchers have tried to answer them through these different disciplinary approaches, or by looking at anti-Semitism as a phenomenon, or gender. And so that's part of the intellectual side of this pursuit. But yeah, you're asking really fundamental human questions, more philosophical ones as well. I don't have any easy answers, but I think trying to identify these pieces in Richard Rhodes's book, as you mentioned, Tim Snyder, Raul Hilberg, the list, James Waller. These are some really important scholars working on these subjects. It helps us see or understand this problem a little bit better, yet another facet of it. But yeah, the bottom line is that we can do this, and we know we can do this. And it's really like existential or even suicidal. Other species don't do this. They don't engage in systematic, intellectually sophisticated, mechanically sophisticated, in terms of the weaponry and organization and the trains, and the chemicals, So we put our efforts, our most, we apply our civilization, our intelligence to this kind of activity is really mind-boggling.
Yeah. What is the future for genocide
We see
study?
a lot of irrationality today here in America. So our capacity to be irrational is like, right?
It's endless.
Every day, aren't we shaking our heads, right? So,
Yeah. I mean, the fact that it took this long, for example, to acknowledge the Armenian genocide,
Mhm.
that's one thing that comes to mind for me, because we've known about it for a long time and nobody had the, I guess, the courage to stand up and just acknowledge the fact that it happened. But um, what is the future of genocide studies and overall, yeah, genocide studies in Eastern Europe in your mind? You touched on Ukraine a little bit, how you helped develop their uh, centers in Kiev and other places, but how about in Poland and places like that?
Yeah, well, funny you should ask. I was just on a call yesterday, a meeting of the academic committee at the Holocaust Museum, and I chair that committee. And there was a really interesting presentation by the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure. It's a closed door meeting, so I'm not going to go into details, but I just wanted to bring your to the attention of your audiences a really important organization that's been around now for about 10 years or 11 years, been funded by the EU, and how important it is not only for these national efforts, whether the Germans are continuing to funding their memorials or the Poles are going to continue to keep Polin, their museums open, and their research institutes open, and free access and critical inquiry is really important, and archival access. But this international kinds of consortiums and networks are absolutely important because these histories, they cross borders. And again, if you think you kind of can own it as your national history, as well as distort it, it's historically kind of inaccurate because the Nazis occupied dominated Europe with their allies, so it really is a European story. And it's important for, as you say, with genocide studies as well, to again pull back and look at this phenomenon more broadly. And that program, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, the new center in Munich, which I had something to do with as well, that the Germans are funding, another a research institute that they're trying to build up, like it exists in the museum in DC, like in Yad Vashem. That kind of investment in that kind of research infrastructure and open access and critical inquiry, these are really fundamental for establishing, furthering this field, and opening it up to other cases of genocide. To with the Holocaust, we can and the sources of the Holocaust, we find things and we then can ask questions of other genocides. And similarly, other genocides raise questions that we bring back to Holocaust studies. My first book on Ukraine drew from a lot of work on what is called colonial genocide. What happened when you have an empire that expands on a continent, like we had here in the United States, like has happened in Australia against the Aborigines there, and that kind of displacement as the colonization process happens, right? That who's ever there locally, that native population is to be removed, tabula rasa, so the invaders and conquerors can set up shop and exploit all the resources. So that kind of pattern of genocidal history, I started to identify in other cases, and then I went back to the Holocaust and I said, hey, the Germans are referring to Ukrainians, the Nazis refer to the Ukrainians in the same ways that the Americans referred to the Native Americans, in all those derogatory terms, and as well using words like the N-word. And so I thought, these histories are, they're the genocide heirs, they're aware of these histories, and Hitler's referring to the what happened in Canada and what happened in Mexico, so they're talking to one another and informing one another. So it's ahistorical, it's intellectually narrow, and to not pay attention to that and realize the interconnectedness of this history.
Yeah. Maybe to begin wrapping up this conversation, I asked two questions at the end of every podcast. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future? It could be as general as you want. And the second one is, what are 5 books, if you want more, feel free, on any topic, whether it be fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to your students or to my audience?
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, what gives me hope is that someone like yourself has, initiated this podcast and picked up my book and read it and is taking an interest in it. There's so much going on in the world. There's so many other things our time is so stretched, like our attention spans, and there is a lot of literature out there and a lot going on, and to stop and pay attention to this history and to appreciate the importance of it, or for institutions to fund these programs, for publishers to publish this work, for people around the world, who help, like, together write these histories, for students to enroll in these courses and write papers about it, and participate in the memorial events. And, that is to watch survivor testimony and try to understand the plight of the victims and their experiences on those videos. I mean, the survivors are passing. So to continue to want to listen to them and take that time, that gives me hope. And that is continuing. And I'm really encouraged by that. And I just believe that will continue and will contribute to that as much as possible. What books? Oh my gosh. I've been reading so many different books now because I'm starting another project, and I kind of pick up books here and there. I, recently read Isabel Wilkerson's book Cast, and just thought that was phenomenal, and was teaching with that, and that really was has stayed with me, and changed my kind of view of race and racism in America and around the world, actually, historically. So I definitely would recommend that. I love poetry. That's something that I find very calming. And I also, the language and the words and the sensory experience I get from reading poetry, and the fact that it's so compact and so rich, just the language. That is one of the things I do to kind of decompress, or just kind of put this history aside. And we have a poet here at Claremont McKenna whose work I've been really enjoying. His name is Henri Cole. And although I have, like many poets that I like to read, I haven't picked up a novel in a while. I should. I haven't read one for a while, I have to admit, because I just do a lot of history reading because I'm always working on these projects. So I can't think about some other books that I have at my bedside, but that's it right now.
Okay, awesome. Well, I really enjoyed your book. Thank you for writing it. If people, what are you working on next? If you want to share that, feel free. And is there a way people can follow your work going forward?
So sure, yeah. And there are other books on photography that are cited in my book, The Ravine, that I've been continue to carry around with me. Actually, I just wanted to mention, gonna shout out to James Curtis, who sent me some of his earlier work that that he was able to obtain on like eBay or something. And I'm just really enjoying that on some of the American photography of kind of the Dust Bowl era, as well of the wartime era, the incarceration of the Japanese here in California. Really beautiful studies, and a lot of great new literature on the Holocaust that I continue to pick up that my colleagues are producing. So David Schneer's new book, the late David Schneer, who died last year tragically, his book Grief, which is amazing. The next project is going to look at 1945. There have been quite a few books on 45, but my colleague and I, Jonathan Petropoulos, we're going to co-author it. We're going to bring kind of our strengths together in a complementary way, and look at these final days of the Reich and the implosion, but really with the question, in this case, of Himmler. I'm going to go back to Himmler. I kind of started with him when I went to graduate school, and I was looking at what he was doing in Ukraine, and I was kind of avoiding him in Berlin, if you will. But now I'm going to go back and look at the last days of his life, and while he was out of the bunker, and what does it mean when you have someone who's the biggest kind of mass murderer one of the biggest we know, certainly in history, most wanted man alive when Hitler committed suicide, after he committed suicide, wandering around northern Germany in broad daylight, trying to find a place to hide out, trying to make peace with the Allies. And when someone of that stature is just, everything's crumbling, right? And when you have the almighty powerful kind of that dissent, what does that look like when you have leaders, whether it's Gaddafi or Saddam or Osama bin Laden? You know, what were Himmler's last days like? Did he really register? He's walking around the same terrain that where the death marches that we're plotting, right? So what is he seeing, and how is he reacting to that, and in that period? So something like that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I wish you all the best. Stay safe, and hope to speak with you in the future.
Okay, Stanley, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for sharing a little bit about your story and your background as well.
Sure. Thank you.